Side 3. I was absolutely determined to prove I could still do the business. I had lost the captaincy, but pulling out of the England team never entered my head. Mike Brearley, the man who had replaced me, asked about my availability for the third test at Headingley. "Beef," he said, "are you sure you want to play? If you don't, I will fully understand." It was excellent psychology. "Of course I bloody want to play, Breers," I said. "That's great," he said. "I think you'll get 150 runs and take 10 wickets." In the event, he was not far wrong. I wanted to put on a performance which would make all the nightmares of the last year disappear. I wanted to do it not only for myself, but also for Kath. She had been through a hell of a lot in the past 12 months. She had suffered for every one of my knocks and setbacks. Wisden recorded the events of the next 5 days as follows. At Leeds, 16th to the 21st of July, England won by 18 runs. A match that had initially produced all the wet and tedious traits of recent Leeds tests finally ended in a way to stretch the bounds of logic and belief. England's victory, achieved under the gaze of a spellbound nation, was the first this century by a team following on, and only the second such result in the history of Test cricket. Kim Hughes won the toss, and the Aussies cashed in on some fairly ordinary bowling on a pitch far worse than their total of 401 for 9 declared suggested. Hughes later described 400 runs on that track as being as good as 1,000, and few disagreed with him. After bowling only 3 overs on the first day, I had a decent crack on the second day and finished with 6 for 95. Still, my success had come too late to stop Australia building what should have been a match-winning score, and next morning we suffered an England collapse to 87 for 5. As I strode to the wicket, bearing in mind the uneven bounce, I decided the best form of defence was attack, and I carried this out with some success, making 50 from 54 balls. It took a brute of a ball to send me back to the pavilion. I was already committed to a forcing shot, as Dennis Lilly managed to extract extra bounce from a delivery just outside the off stump, so I was too late to adjust when it reared sharply, touched the glove, and Rod Marsh took a great catch high above his head. This was the first of several records broken during that match, as Marsh became the top wicket-keeper in Test history, 264 victims in 71 tests. I was fairly satisfied. It was my first Test 50 in 20 Test innings, but we were still in trouble. On a pitch like this, any kind of first innings deficit was likely to be crucial. We eventually followed on, and had already lost Gooch before stumps, out for the second time in the day. Defeat was a foregone conclusion. The rest of our second innings would be little more than a formality, and sure enough, though we held out through the morning session, the following Monday, by 3 p.m, it was more or less all over. We were 135 for 7, and still 92 runs short of making the Aussies bat again. The ground was nearer empty than full, and Ladbrokes made England 500 to 1, with very few takers. Over the years, many people have asked me about the events that followed. What was going through my mind? What did I say to my partners? When did I know it was all going to come good? The truth is, it was just one of those crazy, glorious, one-off flukes. To be perfectly honest, when I went out to bat, I wasn't really interested in the state of the match at all. Then Graham Dilley came to join me at 135 for 7. This was one of his early Test matches. No one rated him as a batsman, so he reasoned he had nothing to lose and decided to go for the big ones. At that stage, the Aussies found it all very amusing. As far as they were concerned, the Ashes were in the bag, and they could stand a bit of light entertainment from a number 9 batsman. But Picker just kept on hitting, so I decided to join in. Suddenly, almost without us noticing, we had edged the total close to, level with, and then unbelievably ahead of the Aussies. We were still not really in the game, but slowly the mood started to change. By this time I was well in the groove. I can't remember playing a defensive shot in the innings. If it was short, I hooked, pulled or cut. If it was in the slot, I drove hard on the basis that even if I got an edge, more likely than not the ball would carry over the heads of the slips. Some of it was sheer, unadulterated slogging. As Mike Brearley said afterwards, pure village green stuff. And I remember one inside edge in particular that flew for 4 past square leg. I was playing by pure instinct. When people recount their favourite moment, they often talk about one specific shot off Alderman. Fair enough, it was a decent blow, but I don't think it was the best. The reason it has stuck in the general consciousness is because of Richie Benno's memorable comment, "No need to look for that one, it's gone straight into the confectionery store," and out again. But the shot I remember above all others was a square cut off the back foot off DK, which was probably the sweetest I've ever hit in my life. It hit the boundary board before anyone even had a chance to move. By this time, Christopher Martin Jenkins in the television commentary box was close to a nervous breakdown, and even I was getting quite excited. For the first time, I started to think about the match situation. I told Picker to keep going, and before he finally perished for 56, there was a tiny glimmer of hope on the horizon. The Australian bowlers were clearly getting annoyed by all this. Jeff Lawson lost his rag to such an extent that he actually sent down 2 beamers. I could accept one as an accident, but 2 had to be more than a coincidence. I stored them away in the memory banks for future reference. They were under pressure, and it showed. There is no doubt they got faster as they got angrier, but they also started to lose control. In the pavilion, Chris Auld was being urged on by Breers. Just hold it together and keep an end up, he told him. The atmosphere was electric. Every run was cheered, and every 4 was greeted with an explosion of noise. Chile did exactly what was required, scoring 29 and helping me add 67 for the 9th wicket. During this stand, I passed my century. It had been scored from 87 balls, and the second 50 from a mere 30 deliveries. The Aussies had suddenly gone very quiet. By this time, I was seeing it like a football, and with Bob Willis, the last man in, making sure I had most of the strike, we managed to add another 31 runs to end the day 351 for 9, 124 runs ahead. I left the field on 145 not out, at that time my highest test score. The following morning the papers were full of Botham's miracle. Pat Gibson, the cricket writer for the Daily Express, summed up the mood when he wrote, "The amazing Ian Botham had the mourners dancing in the aisles at Headingley last night with the greatest comeback since Lazarus." Our hopes of adding 50 the following morning disappeared when Bob Willis was caught by Alan Border off Alderman after we had added only 5 to the total. I finished unbeaten on 149, and we had a lead of 129, which, although nowhere near enough for us to harbour real ambitions of winning, at least meant we were still in the match. Then Bob Willis, who very nearly hadn't been selected, produced one of the greatest bowling performances ever seen. He was fully aware of the situation. During the week before the match, he had discussed with me the possibility that this might be his last appearance for England. No wonder he ran in that day as though his life depended on it. First, I had Graham Wood caught behind by Taylor at 13 for 1. Then Bob produced the most magnificent spell of sustained hostile bowling. First a bouncer to Trevor Chappell took the glove and went to Taylor behind the stumps. Then 2 runs later, I held on to 1 at slip off Kim Hughes. 3 balls later, it was 58 for 4 when Graham Yallop was caught at short square leg by Mike Gatting. You could tell that something had happened to the Aussies. As we came out after lunch, we looked across the balcony and saw the expression on their faces. Talk about rabbits caught in the headlights. By now, the pitch had made batting a lottery, and our adrenaline was pumping. Chile bowled Border at 65 for 5. Bob tricked Dyson into mishooking at 68 for 6. Marsh top-edged him to Dilly to make it 64 for 7, and then Jeff Lawson was caught behind for 1, making the score 75 for 8. Now it was our turn to get the jitters, as this amazing match took on yet another twist. They still needed only 55 to win, and although that should have been too many, bearing in mind the state of the pitch, somehow Lillian Bright managed to put on 35 in 4 overs. Taking a leaf out of our book by going for broke, Bright got stuck into Chile, hitting him for 10 in 1 over. It was all getting a bit frantic. But then came the moment that made all the difference. Bob bowled a ball to Lilly as near to the block hole as he could manage. DK tried to go for the big hit, but only managed to spoon the ball up in the air. It looked safe at first because Gatting, positioned quite deep at mid-on to cope with the slog, had an awful lot of ground to cover. And as we all know, even at his fittest, Gat was always likely to come second to Linford Christie. Everyone froze, except Gat, of course. From somewhere, Gat found the pace he needed, sprinted in, dived, and held the catch inches above the ground. It was like watching the winning goal in the FA Cup final. Although we still had 1 more wicket to take, I think that was the instant we knew the match was ours. Then came one of the most memorable moments in cricket. Bob, who had never run in with more passion, commitment, or sheer self-belief, sent down a perfect Yorker, and Bright stumps were scattered to kingdom come. Unbe-bloody-lievable. And crucially, Bob and I had created a real mental barrier for the Aussies to overcome. From now on, I was their bogeyman, something I exploited against Australian batsmen and bowlers, even up until the World Cup in 1992. No matter what kind of form I was in, the Aussies knew that I was capable of turning a match. Certainly the mood in the England camp was transformed. We had levelled the series. Now it was down to us to push home our advantage. The finale of the next test at Edgbaston was in its way every bit as dramatic as Headingley. Our first innings was a disaster. We were bowled out for 189 and there were no excuses. Australia managed to make 258, and when we made only 219 in the second innings, it seemed that we were there for the taking. Australia needed just 12 more to win than they had done at Headingley, with 2 days to play, and we seemed to have exhausted our supply of miracles. Bob bowled brilliantly again on the fourth morning, but with AB batting solidly, Australia reached 105 for 4, needing 37 more runs with 6 wickets remaining. Then Embry sent down a ball which took AB on the gloves and was caught by Gatt close in. Breers asked me to have a go, and again it was death or glory. In 28 deliveries, I took 5 wickets for 1 run. Marsh was the first to go, bowled. Ray Bright fell leg before for 0. Dennis Lilly was caught behind for 3. Martin Kemp was bowled. And finally, as the noise and atmosphere reached fever pitch, Terry Alderman was bowled for a duck. By 4:30 p.m. on that glorious Sunday afternoon, we were 2-1 up. By the time we got to Old Trafford for the 5th test, I really believed that the Aussies were longing for home. I think they felt the fates had decreed that this was to be England's summer, or rather Botham's summer, and so it proved at Manchester. People have often asked me to compare the 149 at Headingley with the 118 I scored here. In truth, there is no comparison. Where Headingley was a slog, this was something different. John Woodcock in the Times posed the question, was this the greatest test innings ever? It was one of those occasions when everything clicked. Every shot I tried came off, including a couple of sixes off Lilly, which I managed to slap off my eyebrows. Many people forget, however, that I wouldn't have been able to do what I did without the efforts of Chris Tavery at the other end. Tav received a lot of stick during his brief test career for batting at a snail's pace. But he had been brought in to do a specific job at number 3, namely to stay in at all costs, so that an innings could be built around him. It wasn't pleasant, it wasn't pretty, but Tav stuck to the task brilliantly. On this occasion, he made 78 in a 7-hour innings, including the slowest 50 in Test cricket, 304 minutes. But the whole point was that his innings was every run and every minute as important as mine. Once I was out, it enabled 2 more big stands to be built, as Alan Knott made 59 and John Embry made 57, and we established a lead of 505. In some ways, it might have been more appropriate to ask whether, of its type, Tav's second innings was one of the greatest ever. As far as I was concerned, it was an epic. The Aussies were not finished. Yallop and AB both scored hundreds, as they made a fight back to score 402, but in the end the task was beyond them, and the Ashes were ours. What an amazing sensation, and what an incredible transformation from the early part of the summer. It's safe to say that the despair I felt after defeat at Lord's, which forced me into the position where I had to resign, was the worst feeling I had ever had in my career. So what happened at Headingley, Edgbaston and Old Trafford left me with not only a fantastic sense of achievement, but also an overwhelming feeling of relief. In the dark times, no matter how great your self-confidence, you simply never know for certain whether the good times will ever come back. Now I knew for sure that I was on the way up again. My next innings proved that everything was back in place. The Sunday after the Old Trafford Test in a John Player League match against Hampshire at Taunton, I made a century in 67 minutes. The official timing for my second 50 was 9 minutes. The Oval Test, the last of the summer, ended in a draw, and it also brought to a close one of the most significant on-field relationships of my career. Mike Brearley had announced that this was to be his last Test match. Brearley was the fourth in a quartet of major influences on my cricketing career. Brian Close and Tom Cartwright had been the first two. Then came Kenny Barrington. Yet Brearley was different. Rodney Hogg, the Australian fast bowler, summed Breers up perfectly when on meeting Mike for the first time he greeted him with, "Oh yes, you're the fellow with a degree in people." He was quite simply the best captain I have ever played under. 3 times the gold of South Africa has been waved in front of my nose, and 3 times I've had a hard look at it before deciding to put country before cash. The first time was on Keith Fletcher's 1981-82 winter tour to India, and the prime instigator was Sir Geoffrey Boycott. That tour very nearly did not take place. A United Nations committee had blacklisted Geoff Boycott and others due to their sporting links with South Africa, and, after the Test and County Cricket Board had replied that they were not willing to change their team, it seemed certain that the tour would be cancelled. In the end, After the personal intervention of the Indian Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, the ban was lifted, and the tour was allowed to go ahead. I wonder what was going through her mind when, on the 28th of February 1982, the news broke that Boycott and other top England cricketers had landed in South Africa for a rebel tour that had been secretly planned and organised while they were in India. Boyce had been up to his old tricks on the field as well. With 100 in the third test at Delhi, he passed Sir Garfield Sober's record to become the highest test run scorer in history. Having sorted out his milestone, within 2 weeks he was heading home pleading physical and mental tiredness. Throughout this trip, Boyce had been busy trying to recruit players for the rebel tour to South Africa. When the offer was put to me, I was certainly interested. I was a player at the top of my profession, earning only £7,000 per annum, and somebody was willing to offer me a staggering £45,000 to visit South Africa for a couple of months. But the cash was virtually all the deal had going for it. The commercial endorsements that topped up my pay would be under threat if I did go, and this was a crucial stage in my career. Following the disappointments of the West Indies tour and the loss of the England captaincy, at last things were beginning to go right for me. I was in demand, and there were plenty of commercial opportunities coming my way, and if I went, I would certainly be barred from playing for England. Quite apart from anything else, I did not want to be seen to be doing anything that could be construed as supporting apartheid, a system I am totally opposed to. Nevertheless, I would be allowed to say that finance didn't come into it. When you have a wife and a family, you have to consider everything. But at the end of the day, you still have to look at yourself in the mirror. So the answer had to be no. And despite the offer being up to £85,000, the matter was closed. I have to add, whatever I have said about his personality, asked to pick a team to save my life, Boycott would be first on the list. He was the one batsman who could be relied on to never ever give his wicket away. Playing with him was a privilege. To some extent, I had created a rod for my own back with the heroics of 1981. They set the standard by which all future exploits would be judged. My performances in 1982, in particular my highest test score of 208 against India at the Oval, and some quick-fire hundreds for Somerset, kept the pot boiling. But when I suffered the inevitable downturn in form, many believed there must be a sinister reason. During the miserably anticlimactic tour to Australia in 1982-83, the bloodhounds were let loose. Those newspaper editors, who believed their job entailed knocking people down as quickly as they built them up in order to maintain interest and circulation, had decided that Ian Botham was next. I had signed an exclusive contract with The Sun to transmit my thoughts to paper via a ghost writer, but eventually The Sun joined in too in an attempt to rival the sensational stories that were appearing about me elsewhere. Things reached such a state of confusion that on one occasion, when replying to criticism over something that appeared under my name, I managed to come up with the memorable line, "My ghost is writing shit." Kath and I went into 1983 on a happy note, with the news that she had become pregnant again. But the first sign of trouble appeared on the very first day of 1983, when, midway through the England tour down under, The Sun printed a pack of lies about myself and Rodney Hogg. The Sun's story read, "Botham in New Year's Eve brawl with Aussie Test star," which was utter rubbish, and eventually the paper printed an apology. Bob Willis, the England captain, advised me to sever all ties with the paper. My attitude, however, was that the money was good and that no one took the tabloids seriously anyway. How wrong I was. To make matters worse, I also caused problems for myself by criticising the Aussie umpires. The Australian Cricket Board went through the roof, and I was fined £200. But this was nothing when compared to the next bitter blow. During a routine antenatal check, Kath was told by the gynaecologist that no heartbeat could be heard in the womb, and she was advised to have a scan. The results confirmed our worst fears. The baby was dead, and Kath was admitted immediately. We were devastated, and it took Kath in particular an awfully long time to get over the loss. After that long and stressful tour to Australia, something told me that England's 1983-84 tour next winter to Fiji, New Zealand and Pakistan would be a good one to miss. I should have followed my instincts. The cricket by the England side in New Zealand was a disaster, and the worst performance of all was in the second test in Christchurch. We collapsed twice to be all out for 82 and 93, and lost by an innings in just 12 hours. I bowled a pile of filth, and in the second innings managed to get out first ball. The press, with their pens already poised over bucketfuls of vitriol, came to the conclusion that our poor showing, and mine in particular, had everything to do with wild living. There are times during the long separations from family and friends that the pressure of touring catches up on you. It is during these low periods that players need a release. Some find it in drink, and some in female company. I found my escape in the occasional joint, and I now admit that I did take dope on this tour. There were times when I hid in my room, had a joint, and totally switched off. One paper printed a story that almost the entire England team had been high on drugs at a rock concert given by the Pretenders. There was an awful lot of dope being smoked at that gig, but not by us. We were drinking, tequila mixed with orange juice. Perhaps the most absurd story was that during the second test in Christchurch, the England dressing room was an opium den. Even the Mail on Sunday, who had reporters follow us around for the whole tour trying to dig up dirt, admitted they had failed to substantiate this allegation. But when they alleged that an incident took place involving myself, Alan Lamb, 2 women, and a couple of bags of cocaine in a hotel bedroom, the situation was completely out of hand. All these allegations were investigated by the New Zealand police and found to have no basis in truth. But by the time we arrived in Pakistan, a knee injury I suffered in Wellington had flared up to such an extent that I had to return home for immediate surgery. And when my plane landed at Heathrow, the scene at the airport was unbelievable. There was a massive crowd surging around me. Somewhere in amongst this hurricane of cameramen and reporters were Kath and the kids. Liam was subjected to a terrible battering in the crush, and my daughter Sarah was in tears. I was in such a state of shock that I passed right by them before I realised, so I had to backtrack. All I could think of was getting the hell out of that madhouse as soon as possible. At the moment of chaos, I did something I would live to regret. I told reporters that I had never smoked dope in my life. Years later, when I confessed to having done so as part of my agreed compromise with the Mail on Sunday to end my expensive libel action against them, this comment came back to haunt me. When the TCCB banned me from all cricket in the summer of 1987, one of their complaints was that I had revealed in the newspaper that I had used drugs after previously denying it. But that was the future. For the moment, I managed to get myself into even more hot water. Following surgery on my return to England, I gave a radio interview to the BBC's Pat Murphy, during which I attempted to pass a light-hearted remark about the tribulations of touring Pakistan, which can be arduous enough at the best of times. I made a not very convincing attempt at a joke. Pakistan, I said, is the kind of place to send your mother-in-law for a month, all expenses paid. I admit I shouldn't have said it. Certainly the Pakistan authorities believe so. Years later, the joke came back to haunt me when I was given out at the start of our reply to Pakistan's match-winning total in the 1992 World Cup final in Melbourne, and one of the Pakistan fielders taunted me by saying, "Why don't you send in your mother-in-law now? She couldn't do any worse." And at the time, more than once, my mother-in-law, Jan, with whom I've always got on extremely well, was approached in the local high street and asked what she had done to upset me so much. All in all, the joke backfired in a big way. To finish things off, the TCCB set up a disciplinary hearing and I was fined £1,000. The perfect end to a perfect tour. I made the decision at the end of the 1984 series against the West Indies not to make myself available for the winter tour to India. I felt I owed it to Kath, the kids and myself to take a complete break. I thought we would be able to enjoy a winter at home together out of the spotlight. At least, that's what I hoped. On New Year's Eve, the doorbell rang. It was the police, and I was stunned by what I heard next. A small packet of drugs had been found in the pocket of a pair of my trousers that had been sent to the dry cleaners. They had a warrant to search the house. "Go ahead," I told them. "I've got nothing to hide. Search away." So they did, and after rifling around in my bedroom drawer, one of them showed me what he had found. "Excuse me, Mr. Botham, do you know what this is?" Suddenly, my mind went back to an incident during a test match at the Oval a few years back, when a supporter offered me some dope. I had taken it, smoked some later, and then, when I got home, stuffed the remainder in the drawer and forgot all about it. Until then, that is. I have never involved Kath. She never approved, and I never smoked in front of her. I admitted to possessing the cannabis to the police, and saw no reason for Kath to have to go through the ordeal of questioning. Yet that is precisely what she did have to do, for nearly 3 hours. No action was taken against Kath. They charged me with possession of 2.19 grams of cannabis. The next day, the papers were full of the story. Again, it was Kath who had to bear the brunt. She was at her wit's end with having to cope with this incident and its effect on the children. Sarah had problems with kids at school, and she was convinced that her reputation had been as badly damaged as mine. On hearing this, Kath hit the roof. At one point, Kath came into the sitting room, where I was stretched out on the sofa, picked up the glass-top table with both hands and hurled it at me. Luckily, she missed, but the message was clear. Over the next few weeks, we went through a very rough patch, and on the 14th of February 1985, I pleaded guilty to the charge of possessing dope and was fined £100. I was now officially convicted on a drugs charge, and even to this day that label causes me problems at customs and immigration all over the world. The bad publicity had immediately damaging effects, with car manufacturer Saab cancelling a lucrative deal. Then another deal with a stationery firm went down the drain. At least Duncan Fernley, my cricket equipment manufacturer, stayed loyal, and Nike were also very understanding. The episode also served to stoke the flames of indignation among those who had been moaning for some time that I had grown too big for my boots. I started to hear whispers that my recall to the test arena might be in danger. Stories had been filtering back from the England tour party in India that it had been a far happier ship without me on board, that I was too big a personality to be accommodated in the new team. Certainly, David Gower's side had done what no other England team had ever done, coming back from 1-0 down to win a test series out there. The press started to come up with major pieces along the lines of Botham at the crossroads, which made me determined to prove them wrong. The winter off had done my cricket a power of good. A couple of quick hundreds for Somerset at the start of the 1985 season meant that by the time I was picked for the one-day international series, I was in prime form, making 70-odd at Old Trafford. At Headingley in the first test, I really let rip with the ball and took 7 wickets in the match. While going in at 264 for 4 in our first innings, I decided I was going to have some fun, and in 1 hour of mayhem, I smashed 60 from 51 balls. Wisden described it as a golden hour of explosive batsmanship. I hit 85 in the second innings during the second test at Lord's, where Alan Border made a fantastic 196 to help the Aussies square the series, and I was enjoying a real purple patch that was enough to silence the critics. In fact, hitting sixes became a habit during that year. I hit 80 in all. In the final test at the Oval, I wrapped up the series in fine style. Gooch made a magnificent 196, and Gower's golden summer continued in an exquisite innings of 157. Having won the Ashes, we departed for the winter tour of the Caribbean, optimistic that we might be able to compete with the West Indies on their patch for the first time in nearly 20 years. Our high hopes were misplaced. The tour started badly and got worse. Our test series was played 5, lost 5. In mitigation, we were up against the best side in world cricket, performing at the very peak of its ability. The team included 4 world-class batsmen at the top of their form: Gordon Greenidge, Desmond Haynes, Richie Richardson and Viv Richards, and a bowling attack that was the best of its type I'd ever seen. Just running through the names brings back some painful memories. Michael Holding, Patrick Patterson, Malcolm Marshall, Joel Garner, and last but not least, Courtney Walsh. The issue of South Africa also reared its head again. Protests against Graham Gooch and others, who had been on the Rebel Tour in 1982, reached such a pitch that by the time we arrived in Trinidad, our hotel had to be patrolled by armed guards. Then came the first real disaster of the tour. I don't know if you've ever seen the effects of a ripe tomato being squashed in someone's face. It looks a bit like the result of being hit by a bouncer from Malcolm Marshall. And that is exactly what happened to Mike Gatting. The ball spread his nose all over his face. It was one of the most sickening sights I've ever seen on a cricket field. Marshall picked the ball up and found part of Gat's nose still attached to it. He dropped it and nearly threw up. That Sabina Park pitch was fast as lightning and the bounce uneven. It was one of the most difficult and dangerous surfaces I've ever played on. John Woodcock, one cricket writer whose views I've always respected, wrote in the Times, "I never felt it more likely that we should see someone killed." We were not helped by the notorious problem of the sight screen in front of the George Headley stand. It was too low to be of any use when batting against bowlers who were delivering the ball from a height of nearly 12 feet. During that first test, we came up against a West Indian who started the match as more or less an unknown quantity and ended it a match winner. Patrick Patterson was described by local experts as the fastest bowler in the Caribbean after Malcolm Marshall. It turned out that the correct order was the other way round. Pato was murderously quick. I doubt whether we would have had much joy against him, even if the sight screen had been 20 feet high. He was absolutely devastating. By now the press group had swelled to about 60, and there seemed to be no way of escaping them. The atmosphere was poisonous, to say the least. Back home, the merest whiff of a scandal was being lapped up, and everywhere I went a camera was pointed at me. It was unreal. It almost reached the stage where you would spit on the field during a match, and a couple of Fleet Street gremlins would run out and take it away for analysis. I was extremely lucky in those dark days that Jerry Waller, Kath's father, flew out to join me in Barbados, where we were due to play a 4-day match, followed by the 3rd test. During the Saturday of the test match, I popped up into one of the stands for a word with Mick Jagger and Eric Idle. I was happy to accept Mick's invitation to dinner at his house that evening. Mick is an absolute cricket fanatic and loves coming to test matches wherever he can. Mick suggested I should bring a few friends, so I passed on the invitation to those behind us in the stand. Sitting there on that fateful day were Jerry, Bob Willis, his brother David, David's wife Caroline, and an acquaintance of hers, an ex-Miss Barbados, a Miss Lindy Field. I spent most of the evening chatting with Mick about the cricket, but as events unfolded, I came to thank my lucky stars that Jerry had been there. It's one thing denying the lurid allegations made by Miss Field when there is nobody to back you up. It is quite another matter when your father-in-law is your prime eyewitness. I had no reason to suspect Miss Field's motives until a friend of a friend told me that she had returned to London to sell a story about a supposed night of passion involving Ian Botham, broken beds and cocaine. I was not worried about what she was going to write, but I was desperately concerned about the effect on Kath and the children. By the time Kath arrived in Antigua, the story was out. I laid out coke. Beauty Queen's night of passion with Botham. Test ace in sex and drug scandal. The media circus was out in force at the airport, and Kath was so dazed that she didn't seem to recognise me, even though I was standing right in front of her. I gave her a kiss, and the airport became a sea of flashbulbs. The journey to the hotel was spent in total silence. I just couldn't ease the tension, and neither could Kath. Of course she wanted to hear my side of the story, but that basically amounted to me telling her it was all a pack of lies. We tried to return to some kind of normality, but we were under enormous pressure. I was up to my eyeballs with the press, very concerned about Kath and trying to play Test cricket. It was an extremely volatile period. And to say that I made some misjudgments is a masterpiece of understatement. We attempted to behave normally, but it was useless. The tension was so great that it was like a volcano waiting to erupt, and the explosions, when they came, were devastating. Meanwhile, the test match proceeded in a more orderly fashion, with us being thrashed again by 240 runs, and Viv Richards helping himself to the fastest test match century of all time from 56 balls in 83 minutes. Thankfully, with the match over and the rest of the tour party heading home, Viv found us a place on the island where we could relax by ourselves and unwind with no press, cameras or anything else to disturb us. Within 24 hours of being away from the centre of the turmoil, Kath and I felt things coming back together. We spent time walking on the beach, scuba diving and sunbathing. It was like going from hell to heaven in an express lift. Kath was magnificent, and that was the moment I think I really understood just how fortunate I was to have her as a wife. There is an awful lot of truth in the old saying that you just don't appreciate what you've got until you're in danger of losing it. End of side 3. Side 4. The headline in the Mail on Sunday on the 18th of May 1986 began, "Botham, I did take pot." This is one of the most difficult days of my life. I have decided that the time has come for me to be honest with myself, with the game I love, with my friends, and with all those who through thick and thin have helped and supported me down the years. That was the beginning of an article to set the record straight. I admitted I had smoked pot on the New Zealand tour of 1984, and I regretted my denial. It was an agreed compromise with the Mail on Sunday that marked the end of my court case against them. The TCCB acted immediately. They withdrew me from the squad for the one-day internationals against India and announced an investigation into the drugs charge. At their disciplinary hearing on the 29th of May at Lord's, I was found guilty of bringing the game into disrepute and suspended from cricket until the 31st of July. This was not as harsh a sentence as those who wanted me suspended from the neck would have wished. But that day at Lord's was one of the worst of my career, an all-time low. John Embry drove me back to his house where Kath and the kids were waiting, and it started one of my great binges. I've never been so drunk in my life. The next morning I woke up in bed, having no idea how I got there. Liam, who was 8, walked in. "Daddy," he said, I had to put you to bed last night. Why, I asked. Because you were drunk. It was not the proudest moment of my life. Instead of moping around, I decided to do something positive. I learned to fly a helicopter. BBC's 40 Minutes programme hit upon a bright idea of asking me if there was anything in particular I'd like to do to fill the time on my hands. They blanched when I told them, but ended up by supporting the venture and making a film of the whole business, from start to finish, in 3 weeks flat. A lot happened to David Gower and England in my absence, most of it dreadful. David simply couldn't get the response he was after from the team, and when his own form deserted him in the first test against India, the selectors turned to Mike Gatting. But England again got hammered in the next test at Headingley, and despite Gatt's 183 not out in the third test at Edgbaston, that game ended in a tame draw. I wanted to get back into the test side as soon as I'd served my ban. Moreover, I was eager for the wickets to take me beyond Dennis Lilly's all-time record of 355 wickets. First, though, I had to prove my form and fitness. The form was no problem. I walked out to bat in my comeback game against Worcestershire, urged on by Viv Richards, who said, "Beef, you're the man. Now show them you're the man." I made a century off 65 balls. Then, 6 days later, while England was sliding to defeat against the Kiwis, Somerset played Northants in a John Player League match, and I made 175 not out and hit 13 sixes. Gatt pushed for my return with the other selectors and the new manager, Mickey Stewart, and I was duly invited back for the final test match of the summer at the Oval. Looking back now, there are some moments in my career which I simply cannot explain in normal cricketing terms. Batsmen of all the countries I played against often talked about Botham's golden arm, referring to my capacity to take wickets with deliveries that, had they been bowled by anyone else but me, would have been ignored or dispatched to the boundary. My first test wicket, when Greg Chappell dragged a wide long hop onto his stumps, was a classic case in point. As far as they were concerned, it proved just what a lucky so-and-so I was. Naturally, I take exception to that line of thought. Conditions were in my favour that day at the Oval. The atmosphere was heavy, and this, added to the cloud cover, meant that the ball was swinging a lot. I'm not saying my first ball since returning after the ban was the worst I've ever bowled, but it certainly wasn't the best. Unkind observers have described it as a wide half volley that the batsman had no need to play. According to me, it was all part of a cunning plan. In any case, it was good enough for the New Zealand opener Bruce Edgar, who edged the ball to first slip where Graham Gooch held it. Then he came up to congratulate me. "Blimey, Beef, who writes your scripts?" So that wicket meant I was level with D.K. Lilly's record of 355 test wickets. And I didn't have to wait long to pass that, because in the very next over, Crowe shuffled across his crease to a ball of foolish length and was out plumb LBW. Up went the finger from the umpire, up went the crowd, and for an instant neither my scriptwriter nor Gooch's could think of anything to say at all. It was unbelievable. After all the horrors of the previous 2 years, the sense of elation mixed with relief was overwhelming. The reaction of the crowd said it all. They were absolutely marvellous. They had stuck with me through the most harrowing period of my life, and I will never forget their support. What happened at Somerset in the summer and autumn of 1986 brought a sour note, and it reeked of betrayal and disloyalty. During the late 1970s and early 1980s, the county had enjoyed success that had been the stuff of dreams. In part, that was down to a tremendous team spirit, but success demands more than sheer effort. You need flair and magic, and these shone in abundance from our West Indian pairing of Viv Richards and Joel Garner. Time and again, Viv played huge innings, and Joel bowled sides out to win us games. It was unthinkable to me that such great servants of the club could be sacked so callously, yet that is precisely what happened. Loyalty is a virtue I place at the very top of my list, and as soon as I realised that Viv and Joel were being sacked, I resigned. To my mind, the man who deserved all the blame for what happened was the captain, Peter Roebuck. I believe he wanted a young, impressionable side that he could easily control, and the sackings were a fundamental part of his master plan. But the catalyst was Martin Crowe, the New Zealand batsman, who had played in some second-team games with us in 1985. He had showed a huge amount of promise, enough to make Essex interested in signing him. With that offer in his pocket, Crowe spelled out his position to the Somerset committee. If he was not going to play in the Somerset first team in 1987, he had a better deal to take up. At that time, the registration rules were changing. Only one new overseas player was allowed in a county side at any one time. So for Somerset to take Crowe, both Viv and Joel would have to go. It is important to mention that had Viv and Joel been allowed to stay at Somerset for the following season, they would have been treated as English registered players by virtue of their length of service with the club, so both would have been eligible to play. But that was it. With a terse announcement at the end of August, the committee dumped them. As things turned out, Joel only wanted to play another season because his shoulder and knee troubles were bringing his career to an end. Viv, on the other hand, had much more left in him, as he went on to prove by playing for another 6 years with Glamorgan and the West Indies. So Viv and I would not be teammates again, although we would be rivals for a few years to come. And in test matches, Viv wanted to get out to me less than anyone else in the world, and frankly, I wanted his wicket more than anybody else's. On these occasions, the rivalry was intense and razor sharp, but we walked away as friends. We could also laugh on the pitch. Michael Holding once caught me in the box with a vicious delivery, and I was left writhing on the floor in agony. Up sauntered Viv and looked down at me as I was going green. "Where did it hit you, man? I thought you were tough." On another occasion, during a test match at the Oval, when bowling to Viv, I managed to get the ball to bounce steeply, and he gloved it to gully, where Peter Willey took the catch. In true old pro style, Viv stood there rubbing his forearm vigorously, as if to indicate that that was where he'd been hit, and the umpire was fooled into giving him not out. At the end of the over, I walked past him and said, "Come on then, Smokey, show me the bruise." "Hey, Beefy," he said, "we don't bruise." I never wanted any opponent I played against to do well against me, or England. But when it came to the emotional moment of Viv's last test match in England, I made an exception. I was recalled for the 5th test of the 1991 series against the West Indies at the Oval. It was my first test appearance for 2 years, and it was to be Viv's last in England and his last as West Indies captain. Before the match, I took him to one side and said to him, "You know what I would like, Smokey? You to score 100 and we to win the match." The Somerset split ended an era, but could not break a friendship that had been forged from our first meeting. Time heals even the deepest wounds, and Viv, Joel and I are now honorary members of Somerset, and proud to be. I was certain of my decision to leave Somerset, but the club has been a huge part of my life. I had 15 good years there as part of a great team, and that means an awful lot. I moved on to Worcestershire, where I had links with their chairman, Duncan Fernley, who provided me with my bats. The Carphone Group was sponsoring me, as well as Graham Dilley, who arrived at the same time. Our arrival provoked huge interest. Membership at Worcestershire rocketed, and I was joining a club that was full of hope, and with some big stars to back up that belief. Graham Hick, Steve Rhodes, Neil Radford, Phil Newport, Tim Curtis, and Richard Illingworth were players heading for the top, and they had a marvellous motivator in their captain, Phil Neal. I could not have found a better place. Worcestershire won the county championship twice, the Sunday League twice, and the Benson Hedges Cup during my 5 very happy years with the club. And looking back now, the decision to leave the club to join Durham, where I played out the last 2 seasons of my career, was one of the worst mistakes I ever made. There were, of course, great attractions in going to Durham. It was a new county apparently full of ideas and ambition, and the prospect of playing home matches only an hour's drive from where I lived was extremely appealing. But I should have known better. There were major problems behind the scenes, and when it came to leaving, the petty-mindedness of the club appalled me. It was agreed I would be paid until the end of July, and that I could keep my club car until the end of August. When I rang the club to tell them that I had not been paid, they told me the last cheque would not be released until the car had been handed back. It was ridiculous, but it summed up how what should have been a great finale to my career turned into a sorry ending. My efforts for the Leukemia Research Fund will not stop until the disease is beaten. It is the most worthwhile thing I have ever done in my life. In 1977, when I handed over £50 in Musgrove Park Hospital for a party for those children, it changed my life. As time progressed, I started to think about how I could exploit my position in the public eye to raise real money for the fight against the disease. One Easter in the Lake District, Kath and I were agonising over the next move when it hit me. "I know, a sponsored walk," I said, "from John O'Groats to Land's End." Kath looked at me with disbelief. "I thought you'd come up with something sensible." My mind was made up. Whatever the difficulties, I was going to do it. I only had to think of those children who looked so well but were dying. I needed a spur. That was it. Bearing in mind that each walk now takes from a year to 18 months for Kath to organise, it is amazing that our first effort was more or less made up as we went along. Publicity was absolutely vital, and in this respect, I was lucky that Chris Lander was one of the 3 guys who walked every step of the way with me. The other two were John Border, the brother of Alan, and Phil Rance, a Manchester businessman whose father had died of leukemia. Crash was working for the Daily Mirror and had no intention of staying for the trip, but Alistair Ross, the Sun reporter, had a £1,000 bet with me that he, Ross, would still be standing by the fourth day. Pitching the Daily Mirror against the Sun worked a treat. Our other stroke of good fortune was the response of the BBC. Initially, they had planned to dip in and out of the walk on their breakfast time programme, introduced by Frank Boff and Selina Scott. But when they received so much positive feedback from the first of these broadcasts, they decided to stick with the walk until the end. When I drove up to John O'Groats with Kath on Friday the 25th of October 1985 to start the walk the following day, I really did not know what to expect. My attitude was simply, there's the road, walk on it until you get to the other end. My England teammates thought I was completely bonkers, and I must admit that I had no idea about the technicalities, but I quickly learnt. It was crucial to set my pace and not stop. You simply cannot change your stride pattern or you suffer. The hardest part is dealing with the pain barrier. I knew there would be a bit of physical hardship, but I never really understood what it would be like. After a while, I had no say in the matter. Physically, mentally and emotionally, I and my colleagues became prisoners of the walk. The first day was a breeze, but on day 2 I nearly did myself so much damage that the walk might have finished there and then. Stupidly, I ran the 36-mile stage in bursts, and by the end of the day I was in desperate agony. The pain was almost unbearable, as if a dozen guys in hobnailed boots had been kicking my shins for a week. I learnt that this is a common complaint among serious walkers. The only remedies are massage and sleeping with your feet propped up on pillows, but in truth that particular pain never really leaves you. Scotland was bleak, and the roads seemed to run forever. The first week in particular was extremely testing. There could be 50 miles between towns, and isolation was difficult to cope with. What helped drive us on was the amazing public response. The lorry drivers, for example, were the first who made us realise that the word was spreading. They would toot their horns as they passed us, and then, a week later, as they completed their return journey, the same guys would stop and hand over bags stuffed full of money that they had collected. That lifted us more than words could say, and I suddenly began to realise how we were capturing the public's imagination. The Gretna leg was very tough, probably the worst of the lot. We started at first light and were on the road for 13 hours with the last 2 done in darkness, hemmed in by cars zooming past and heading straight into driving rain. Brian Close walked that stage in totally the wrong shoes, but Closey, being Closey, he was not going to be put off. The leukemia research people thought if they made £100,000 from the whole walk, they would be doing well. But the Scots proved their generosity beyond any doubt, and by the time we had crossed the border, there was already £100,000 in the bank. And to top it all off, Becky was born on the first walk. It was a case of coming straight off the road, into a bath, throwing on some clothes, and heading north to Doncaster Royal Infirmary. I managed to have a couple of hours with Kath and Becky, and Liam and Sarah were also at the hospital, so it was a family reunion. Exhausted, I lay on the bed next to Kath, asked how she was, and promptly fell asleep. The reception we received from the great British public was magnificent. We were literally going past people's doorsteps where there was a tremendous atmosphere, almost to the point of rivalry, in each village. That picked us up when we hurt the most. Walking into Taunton was unbelievable. All my old mates were there stopping the traffic and charging drivers a leukemia toll. There were dozens of jugs of cider and a banner, "You're home, Beefy, welcome back." It was market day and the place was chaos, but it hardly mattered because the street collection raised an incredible £26,000. From there, it was on to Bristol with David Graveney, and we walked into this huge ticker-tape welcome with jazz bands playing and thousands of people lining the streets. It took my breath away, and in the buckets that day, we collected over £40,000. Trudging west towards Devon, there was a surprise awaiting me. I was flagged down by a chap who jumped out of a Rolls-Royce, popped a huge cheque in my hand before disappearing swiftly. It was an old friend, Elton John. Finally, on a freezing December day, we completed the last mile to the sea at Land's End, and hurled Crash through the breakers. By that time, he didn't care. We had done what we'd set out to do, and raised over £1 million in the process. The walk had been a fantastic experience. It had created new friendships and bonded existing ones. What's more, we had had a lot of fun. Early on, we had set up a kangaroo court. in order to try regular walkers on trumped-up charges. Once I was done for singing, but got off on a technicality. I can't sing. Graham Morris, the sports photographer, almost felt the full force of the law for losing the top of a mobile home which he had attempted to drive under a low bridge in Aviemore. His plea, which was somehow accepted by the jury, was that he had come from a broken mobile home. And across the years there have been more walks, around the Channel Islands, Belfast, the East Coast, and the Hannibal Alps walk, complete with elephants, and more are planned. But apart from the research fund and the kids, the main beneficiary of the walk has been myself. I can't put a value on the experiences I have had. Ever since that cold day in April 1980, when I first felt a twinge in my back, I knew my career was one bad injury away from crisis, and that moment arrived in 1988. I'd just taken my first championship wicket of the summer when I dived to stop a ball in the slips and fell awkwardly. Soon afterwards, we left the field because of rain, and when it was time to get back on the pitch, I couldn't move. The operation I had put off for so long had become a necessity. The surgeon, John Davies, gave me an 80% chance of making a full recovery, but only a 50% chance of playing top-class cricket again. For the next 6 months, I could still hardly move, and the prospect of being on the scrap heap at 32 scared me to death. What had sustained me during my rehabilitation was ambition, pure and simple. There was nothing I wanted to do more than play cricket at the top. Finally, after a 23-month absence, I walked out to bowl against the Australians in the third test at Edgbaston. I had to wait longer than usual to make my mark, but I tracked opener Jeff Marsh, LBW, in my 13th over. I batted for 2.5 hours for 46. My disappointment of being left out of the 1990 squad was intense, and the likelihood was that I would never be selected for England again. So by the time I actually did return 2 years later for the final test against the West Indies in 1991, I was doubly determined to show the selectors what they had been missing. And then I was selected for the trip to New Zealand at the end of 1991, followed by the World Cup to be played in Australia and New Zealand. In January 1992, I arrived in New Zealand and was called into the side for the third test at Wellington, where I collected my 100th cap. At this stage, our success in New Zealand put us in high spirits for the World Cup, but it had also taken a lot out of us. What we should have done, in hindsight, was to have taken some time off to recharge the batteries, but instead we flew straight to Sydney and started playing practice games against ourselves. The next month or so was highly successful on the field, but murder off it, what with the constant travelling between games and the insistence of Gooch and Stewart in pushing ourselves to the limit on the training ground. We began in Perth against India, where we won a tight game. From there we travelled to Melbourne, where we beat the West Indies easily. Then came the match which turned out to be crucial. The weather at the Adelaide Oval that day was overcast, and there was a bit of life in the pitch for the bowlers. We were inspired and rolled Pakistan over for 74, their lowest ever one-day total and the lowest one-day score by a test side in the World Cup. We were well on our way to victory when the rain began falling persistently and the match was declared void. It was very disappointing in the light of what happened in the final. The next match, against the Aussies in Sydney, was a great night under the floodlights, and I ended up with 4 for 31. Then I opened with Gucci and scored my first ever half-century in the World Cup. We strolled to victory by 8 wickets, then took another step towards the final when we went up country to Ballarat and thrashed Sri Lanka. After that we returned to Melbourne to play South Africa for the first time in international cricket since 1965, and here it became clear that the heavy workload was beginning to take its toll. Gooch had pulled a hamstring in Ballarat. De Freitas did play, but was limping heavily and had to go off, while Dermot Reeve failed to complete his third over after falling and bruising his back. In fact, we were lucky to get out of that game in one piece. The casualty list was growing. We flew to Wellington to play New Zealand, and Derek Pringle broke down in mid-over with a rib injury. The Kiwis then sent us to our first defeat. Just how exhausted we were by this stage was proved when we collapsed to a humiliating defeat in our last qualifying match against Zimbabwe. Our opponents had lost 18 successive one-day matches before we met at Albury that day, and we were clear favourites to lift the cup. But having bowled them out for 134, we simply ran out of steam in our reply, when we fell foul of a chicken farmer named Ed O'Brands, who took 4 for 21 as we were rolled over for 125. Under the circumstances, we were grateful for the rain and the tournament's rain rules in the semi-final in Sydney against South Africa, which gave us the match. The South Africans took the blow as well as could be expected, while our feelings were mixed. However, we were in the final. This was my second appearance in the final. Back in 1979, I'd played against the West Indies and been on the receiving end of one of Viv Richards' greatest innings. We lost by 92 runs. I missed the next occasion England got to the final in 1987, and this was the last chance for me. The purists criticise one-day cricket as nothing more than a pyjama game which bears no resemblance to the real thing. And in some ways, of course, they are right. But anyone who has played in a World Cup competition considers it to be the highlight of their career. Victory means you are the best side in the world. Moreover, considering the ups and downs of my career and the injury that nearly ended it, this was the one prize I was determined not to let slip. We started off well enough, after Imran won the toss and put Pakistan into bat. Their total of 249 was a stiff one, but by no means out of reach. Then came crushing disappointment. As I opened the England innings, a ball from Wasim Akram moved so much that it deceived me completely. I played and missed outside the off stump. Unfortunately for me, the umpire decided I had played and hit. This was one of those sickening moments when, although I knew I hadn't hit the ball, I also knew the distance it had travelled off the straight meant that it would have been easy for any umpire to make a mistake. It was at that point that one of the Pakistan fielders, Amir Sohail, harked back to my comments of nearly a decade before and goaded me, "Why don't you send out your mother-in-law now? She couldn't do any worse." I was angry and powerless and out of the game, and nothing I could do from that point would influence the outcome. We slumped to 69 for 4, yet our hopes started to rise again when Lammy and Neil Fairbrother put on 72 in 14 overs. Victory was not out of the question. Then came the moment when all prospects of winning disappeared. Bearing in mind the enormous controversy about to erupt over ball tampering, the two deliveries Wasim Akram produced to dismiss Lammy and Chris Lewis, first ball, became more significant as the months rolled on. Let me put it this way. I've never seen a ball behave like those two did. First, Wasim Akram, bowling round the wicket, sent down a ball to Lamb that came totally out of the blue. It started off heading wide down the leg side, then 2/3 of the way down the wicket, it started swinging towards the off stump. The next thing Lammy knew, his off bail had been removed. The look of absolute astonishment on his face said it all. The next delivery, to Chris Lewis, started wide of off stump and suddenly swung in like a banana and smashed into the timbers. We have all swung the ball in our time, but I've never witnessed anything like that. And that was the end of our World Cup dreams. By his own admission, Imran Khan, the former Pakistan captain, and one of the most successful all-rounders in the modern game, tampered with cricket balls. Yet according to Imran, ball tampering is not cheating. Well, according to me, and to many others, it is. For the sake of the game, it is time that the ICC decided who is right and who is wrong. In Evo Tennant's authorised biography, Imran stated, "I occasionally scratched the side of the ball and lifted the seam. Only once did I use an object. When Sussex were playing Hampshire in 1981, the ball was not deviating at all. I got the 12th man to bring on a bottle top, and it started to move around a lot." 1 week after his admission, Imran quit as Pakistan's representative on the International Cricket Council, an action their chief executive, David Richards, described as entirely appropriate. All clear so far? It is what happened after Imran made his confession that you may find puzzling. It certainly baffled me. Firstly, he confirmed that he had used a bottle top to gouge the surface of the ball. Then he appeared on ITV's Sport in Question to demonstrate to millions of British television viewers exactly how he did it. Imran spelled out his point of view in some detail. His position was that tampering with the ball by scratching the side and lifting the seam were an accepted part of the game and did not amount to cheating. Correct me if I'm wrong, but haven't I read somewhere that they do amount to cheating? The laws of cricket 42.4 and 42.5 governing unfair play, for example. Law 42.4, lifting the seam. A player shall not lift the seam of the ball for any reason. Should this be done, the umpire shall change the ball. Law 42.5, changing the condition of the ball. Any member of the fielding side may polish the ball, providing that such polishing wastes no time and that no artificial substance is used. No one shall rub the ball on the ground or use any artificial substance or take any other action to alter the condition of the ball. In Tennant's book, Imran claimed that at one time or another, almost every seamer has been guilty of ball tampering. Later, in an article in the Daily Telegraph, he stated, No one will accuse the likes of John Snow, Dennis Lilly, Malcolm Marshall, Andy Roberts and Sir Richard Hadley of cheating. But he added, yet they are not likely to deny that occasionally they too lifted the seam. Then, in an interview published with The Sun, he declared that the biggest names in English cricket have all done it. Well, Imran, that is news to me. With hand on heart, I can categorically state that never once have I done anything illegal with a cricket ball. Unlike Imran Khan, I have never lifted the seam, I have never scratched the surface of the ball, and I have never gouged one with a bottle top. Success on the cricket pitch has opened doors that would otherwise have been closed. Off the field as well as on it, I've had a life so full it would take 10 men to live it. Away from the cricket pitches of the world, it has been Beefy the pilot, the actor, the golfer, the quiz show captain, and so on. The most high profile of all these activities has been the BBC's Question of Sport. I had known Bill Beaumont since 1981, when he was leading England to rugby's Five Nations Grand Slam, and over the years our friendship has grown stronger and stronger. When it comes to Question of Sport, our relationship makes sure that things never get out of hand, and I can't think of a single person who has not entered into the right spirit. One of our funniest moments involved Gazza, who turned up with strict instructions from Terry Venables that the studio should be an alcohol-free zone. As a responsible captain, I decided to help Gazza beat the ban without him even knowing. I convinced him that Avocar was non-alcoholic, and he put a fair few away before he realised. Of course, I only ever intended to help him loosen up a little. That he was on Bill's side never came into the reckoning. Finally, the moment arrived when Bill turned round and told me that Gazza was, in fact, on my team. Needless to say, we came a good second that evening. I've been on stage both in panto and on the speaking tours I've done over the years with Viv Richards, Alan Lamb, Jeremy Atkinson and David English, the creator of Bunbury Tales. English, or Loon as I call him, is a complete psycho, and over the years he has played a big part in cheering me up whenever I've needed it. His Bunbury Cricket 11, who play matches for charity all over the country, has included stars like Roger Daltrey, Bill Wyman, Eric Clapton, with whom I have shared many good times. I got on well with Eric, as I have done with a number of rock stars. In a way, our lives are similar. We are both on a big stage, and we both find privacy at times hard to come by. Eric was a regular visitor to Worcester, and one memorable day he issued the following challenge. Score 100, and I'll play in the pub tonight. I kept my side of the deal, cracking 125 in a Sunday League match against Essex, and what followed was a brilliant night. Deep in the Worcestershire countryside, both teams descended on this pub, where people were sipping pints or playing dominoes, while a dog was yawning by the fireplace. Suddenly, in walked the world's greatest guitarist, asking the landlord if he could plug in his amp and play a few songs. Later, as word spread, we were joined by the bride, groom, and most of the guests at their wedding reception taking place up the road. As a performing artist, I've never had to confront the huge crowds that Eric has, but the first time I appeared in panto, I felt as if the eyes of the world were on me. I persuaded Max Boyce to let me appear in his show Jack and the Beanstalk. Max was hardly keen at first, because I suspect he thought I wasn't being serious, but I was. Although the reviews were not exactly ecstatic, one critic said the only thing more wooden than the Beanstalk was Ian Botham. The kids loved it. We did 3 seasons together, and then the following year I appeared in Dick Whittington with my good friend Robin Asquith. Performing in these shows has been one of the most satisfying things I've ever done, but probably the most dramatic of my exploits has taken place up in the sky. I first dabbled with flying back in 1981, when I called in at the Bristol and Wessex Club for lessons. I was introduced to Alan Dyer, a pilot, and a great friendship developed. My appetite for the high life had also been whetted by an invitation from John Blackwell to go flying with the Red Arrows. John was the leader of the team at the time, and it was an offer I just could not refuse. I went up to the team's base and enjoyed the most exhilarating experiences of my life. I got on well with the lads, so well in fact, that when I had my benefit in 1984, the Red Arrows paid me an extraordinary tribute. At the close of play, at the end of a game at Taunton in midsummer, the Red Arrows made a flyby to give me a salute. I stood in the middle of the square, looking up at the sky, and right on time, the planes appeared on the horizon and roared in, low over the ground. It was a great gesture. My own flying partnership with Alan Dyer has not been quite so professional. Together, we took part in the King's Cup air race at Finningley in Yorkshire in 1982. My job was to keep an eye out for other planes. Then, a few years later, we made our way together to the Paris Air Show, and over the French coast Alan asked if I fancied some low flying. It seemed a good idea, and Alan asked me to keep a lookout. The plane was whizzing along over these villages, and I was sitting in the co-pilot seat, staring up at the wide blue yonder. "What the bloody hell are you doing?" yelled Alan. "I'm keeping an eye out for pilots," I replied. "I said pylons, not pilots." So life away from cricket has been rich and varied, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. I've always been a man of action first and foremost. I fully sympathise with the mountain climbers, the yachtsmen, cave divers, with all the dangerous sportsmen of the world. My attitude is very much the same as theirs. If it is there to do, then I do it. I make no apologies for what I've done or the way I am, but I'm certainly not blind to my mistakes. In the end, I have no one to answer to but me, Kath, and my family. The bottom line is that I have tried to be true to myself. There is no denying, however, that for those around me, and particularly for Kath, there has been a high price to pay. In fact, bearing in mind what they have all had to put up with, the greatest tribute I can pay to Kath is the fact that Liam, Sarah and Becky are so self-sufficient and well-adjusted. They are a credit to Kath. And of course, she and they are not the only thing I have to be grateful for. This is not a sob story. Neither of us are looking for sympathy. All things considered, it has been one hell of a life. There have been lows, as you have just read, but there have been fantastic highs as well. The runs, the wickets, the catches, the walks, the scrapes, the friends, the places I've been to, the wonders I've seen, and the sheer fun have made everything more than worthwhile. If I had my time over again, I wouldn't change a letter. My motto has always been the same: life, be in it.